The nervous system can be split into two major divisions: the central nervous system, or CNS, composed of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which connects the central nervous system to the rest of the body. The peripheral nervous system is divided into the somatic and autonomic branches. One of the major distinctions between the somatic and autonomic branches is that the somatic is more involved in voluntary actions, like moving our arm, whereas the autonomic branch is more involved in activity that occurs automatically, like pupil dilation or digestion. We'll hear more about the autonomic branch of the nervous system when we explore the fight or flight response. The brain can be divided into three basic units: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The hindbrain controls the body's vital functions, such as respiration and heart rate. It includes the medulla oblongata, the pons, and a wrinkled ball of tissue called the cerebellum. The cerebellum coordinates movement and is involved in learned rote movements. When you play the piano or hit a tennis ball, you're activating the cerebellum. The uppermost part of the brainstem is the midbrain, associated with processing of vision, hearing, motor control, sleep-wake, arousal, alertness, and temperature regulation. The substantia nigra is just one of many components within the midbrain. Substantia nigra is Latin for black substance, reflecting the fact that parts of the substantia nigra appear darker than neighboring areas. This part of the brain is densely packed with neurons that produce dopamine, hence its role in reward, addiction, and movement. Parkinson's disease is characterized by the death of dopaminergic neurons in parts of the substantia nigra. When people see pictures of the brain, it is usually the cerebrum that they notice. This structure, along with additional inner structures such as the thalamus, hippocampus, hypothalamus, and limbic system, compose the forebrain. While memorizing the vast number of brain structures is beyond the scope of this course, the organization of basic structures helps to provide a reference point when discussing the relation of specific structures to specific functions. The brain is the most complex part of the body. This 3-pound organ is the seat of intelligence, interpreter of the senses, initiator of body movement, and controller of behavior. The brains of vertebrates are made of very soft tissue. Living brain tissue is pinkish on the outside and mostly white on the inside, with subtle variations in color. In a typical human, the cerebral cortex, the largest part, is estimated to contain 15 to 33 billion neurons, each connected by synapses to several thousand other neurons. If one were to remove the top of the skull, the brain as we commonly see it pictured would not be immediately visible. Before one gets to the actual brain, there are a number of layers of connective tissue membranes to get through. The outermost layer, closest to the skull, is a thick, fibrous membrane called the dura mater, Latin for tough mother. In this picture, you can see the dura mater pulled back, revealing the brain inside. Meningitis is a bacterial or viral infection of the meninges that causes inflammation. Interestingly, the brain itself has no pain receptors, but the meninges do. Cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, is a clear, colorless bodily fluid found in the brain and spine. It is produced in the choroid plexus of the brain. The CSF occupies the space between the two inner meninges and is also found inside the brain and spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid provides buoyancy for the brain, reducing the brain's weight to about a 50th of what it would be without floating in CSF, and also provides protection from injury when jolted, for example in a car accident. As researchers study CSF, they've learned that it serves additional protective functions. Within the brain, there are four major CSF-filled cavities called ventricles. Hydrocephalus, also known as water on the brain, is a medical condition in which there's an abnormal accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, in the ventricles. This may cause increased pressure inside the skull and progressive enlargement of the head, convulsion, tunnel vision, and mental disability. Hydrocephalus can also cause death. Although it does occur in older adults, it's more common in infants. Hydrocephalus can be caused by either a blockage in the normal CSF flow through the brain, or by an overproduction of cerebrospinal fluid. Treatment for hydrocephalus generally involves the surgical implant of a shunt that drains excess CSF fluid into other body cavities. Just as too much CSF can be a problem, so can too little. I once had to undergo a procedure involving a large needle being inserted into my spinal cord at the base of my back. After resting for a couple of hours, I got up and drove myself from the hospital to my hotel. I didn't feel great. My back was killing me, so I got some bed rest for a few hours and then met with some friends and family members who were in town. After about 20 minutes of walking around, I began to experience the most terrible headache that I'd ever experienced. Searing pain. I called the surgeon's direct number and was told that the hole caused by the needle puncture had probably not healed and I was leaking CSF. My options: return to the hospital, where they would have to draw a small amount of blood and inject it back into the hole to help seal it up, or stay in bed. The latter option would give me a 50% chance of the hole healing itself. I chose the latter, and thankfully the hole healed itself, but this experience clearly demonstrated the importance of adequate CSF and how easily that delicate balance could be disrupted. Normal function of the brain's control centers is dependent upon adequate supply of oxygen and nutrients through a dense network of blood vessels that enter the central nervous system through holes in the meningeal layer. The entire vascular blood vessel system of a brain, down to the smallest capillaries, can be injected with liquid plastic that fills the blood space and rapidly solidifies. The surrounding tissue is then corroded away with an acid or alkaline solution, leaving a hardened cast that accurately represents the vascular system. Also pictured here is a scanning electron microscope image of the microscopic blood vessels that carry nutrients to neurons in the brain. This sample, from human cerebral cortex, shows a large blood vessel at the surface of the brain, which sends down thin, densely packed capillaries to deliver blood through the entire cortex. The cells in the blood vessel walls are joined tightly to one another, forming the blood-brain barrier, which blocks the passage of many toxins and pathogens. The cerebrum sits at the topmost part of the brain and is split into two halves, hemispheres, by a deep fissure. Despite the split, the two cerebral hemispheres communicate with one another through a thick tract of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum, which lies at the base of this deep groove. In this picture, with part of the cerebrum cut away, you can see this underlying tract of nerve fibers connecting the hemispheres. Though there are other connections between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum is the largest. You would think that severing this connection would have dramatic consequences, but as we'll see later, the effects are surprisingly subtle. The cerebrum is divided into four distinct lobes: the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. These lobes were originally a purely anatomical classification, based on some of the cerebrum's largest visible grooves or fissures, but have been shown to also be related to different brain functions. The frontal lobe is located at the front of the brain and is associated with reasoning, motor skills, higher level cognition, and expressive language. At the back of the frontal lobe, near the central sulcus, lies the motor cortex, which is involved in initiating movements. Damage to the frontal lobe can lead to changes in sexual habits, personality, and attention, as well as increased risk-taking. The parietal lobe is located in the middle section of the brain and is associated with processing tactile sensory information such as pressure, touch, and pain. A portion of the brain known as the somatosensory cortex is located in this lobe and is essential to the processing of the body's senses. Damage to the parietal lobe can result in problems with verbal memory, an impaired ability to control eye gaze, and abnormalities in body image and spatial relations. The temporal lobe is located on the bottom section of the brain, near the ears. This lobe contains the primary auditory cortex, which is important for interpreting sounds and the language we hear. Damage to the temporal lobe can lead to problems with memory, speech perception, and language skills. The occipital lobe is located at the back portion of the brain and is associated with visual processing. It's the location of the primary visual cortex, which receives and interprets information from the eyes via the optic nerves. Damage to this lobe can cause visual problems and can even affect visual imagery, the ability to mentally picture something. In the third week of development, a neural plate is formed along the dorsal side of the embryo. This neural plate is the source of the majority of neurons and glial cells in the mature human. A groove forms in the neural plate, and the neural plate wraps in on itself to make a hollow neural tube that will later give rise to the brain and spinal cord. The most anterior part of the neural tube expands rapidly due to cell proliferation and eventually gives rise to the brain. Gradually, some of the cells stop dividing and differentiate into neurons and glial cells. These newly generated neurons migrate to different parts of the developing brain, where they self-organize into different brain structures. This migration is guided by chemical signals and trails that the migrating neurons can follow along a scaffold of radial glia and even blood vessels. Once the neurons reach their intended location, they extend axons and dendrites, which allow them to communicate with other neurons via synapses. During early development, many neuronal connections are made both locally and over long distances, but whether these connections survive depends on whether they are activated. Neurons that fire together wire together. The notion of neural Darwinism suggests that many more connections are made than are needed, and only active connections will survive. While basic structural connections are pre-programmed, it's our interaction with the environment that shapes these connections during development.